Corey, it is all yours.
Awesome. All right. Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, good. This is I use Zoom every week without fail on a very specific schedule as part of an ongoing Dungeons and Dragons game. Other than that, I don't think I've used it for an actual meeting before or a presentation. So if you hear like dice rolling in the background, you know I've completely lost track of what I'm doing on here. Yep, this is a presentation that I did this past DrupalCon, and presenting it for the Drupal for Gov group. I am Corey Vilhauer. I work at a place called Blend Interactive. We are located in Sioux Falls, South Dakota, and we handle large-scale, content-heavy development implementations. I'm there primarily to handle the content and user experience side of things, which often ends up boiling into helping clients understand what they can do to make their sites more accessible. I'm also an avid biker, which is notable because here in Sioux Falls, we've really moved forward in some level of bike advocacy. We're sort of shifting from a small to a medium-sized city, and in doing so, we've really spent a lot of time slowly building the infrastructure that we've needed to maintain a healthy bike community. But it's not necessarily something that's happening overnight, because as you probably can imagine, Americans really like cars. And if you think that we like cars as a country, you should see how much we like our cars in the Midwest, where the cities are hours apart, and the closest IKEA to us is a full state away. It's 4 hours away, which brings us to a really funny impasse. We're lucky enough to be in an age where the swell of sustainability and fitness are coalescing upon the bicycle groups in our communities, but some habits are really hard to break. So you end up with bike lanes that look more like parking spots, and we struggle with understanding the basics of car-focused roads. Potholes and signage need to be brought up to a specific level in order to be bike-friendly. I wish this was a thing we could really simply assign to bicycles in existing roadways, but in reality, there's a separation in everything between intent, between building an infrastructure, and the actual action and interpretation of that infrastructure. It's prevalent wherever any level of accessibility is found. And we see this when wheelchair ramps are built into a storefront, but upon entering the store, the aisles are too narrow to get around. We see this when interpreters are brought in to sign for a presentation, but they're placed in an area that not everyone can see. So if I dare segue into a webinar, this is what happens to our websites. We do all we can to make sure that our sites are built to pass all of the technical accessibility tests, but we don't give enough thought to how accessibility will be maintained on the editorial side. And so this is what I'm going to talk about today. I want to talk about web accessibility, but not necessarily about navigation patterns or color contrasts. I want to talk about the parts of accessibility that we as editors have control over, and that we as editors will most commonly find gray areas within. These are the areas where language takes over, essentially, where checking a box no longer cuts it, where we have to depend on actual judgment calls, which can be really, really scary. And I hope that after this, they don't seem as scary. Through this talk, we'll dive into what it means to be an accessible editor. We'll talk about the scope of what falls under editorial accessibility, so namely the things that we can do to provide a more accessible site using just the editing tools that we hopefully are provided through the CMS. We'll talk about individual fields, but we'll also talk about the art of writing as well. And then finally, we will touch briefly on what we can do to promote it within our organizations. Ultimately, this is a talk for editors. It's a talk for site managers. It's a talk for webmasters and people who write for sites. It's largely about web writing, to be perfectly honest. But if you are a web developer, or if you're a project manager and you haven't closed the browser already, I hope that you get a better idea of the types of things that your editors will need from a Drupal site. Just a little bit of housekeeping. I have a full screen view in order to show the slides, so I can't see if any questions pop up through Zoom. And I believe what we wanted to do is we wanted to set this up so that if there's any questions, I'll answer them at the end. So we'll just plan on a Q&A probably about 2:55, or hopefully 2:55, right before sort of the end of the time to handle any questions, just an FYI. But first, let's dive into what we mean when we talk about web accessibility, a really high-level view of what this means. On the web, accessibility is the practice of removing barriers for people with disabilities. So much like new building construction must provide accessible entrances, and business must provide reasonable accommodations to employees with disabilities, websites have to be created in a way that allow access to information despite any existing or future disability. And sometimes during presentations like this, you'll see accessibility written as A11Y, which is a clever little abbreviation because it conveys two things. First, it represents the word accessibility. Obviously, accessibility is an A and a Y with 11 letters in between. More importantly, it provides insight into the purpose of accessibility. Accessibility isn't, we are being an ally to those with differing needs. We're purposely making things better for those, for example, who can't see, or those who are colorblind, or those who are unable to use a mouse. This is, in essence, the idea of inclusive design. And when I say inclusive design, or when we talk about accessible design, I don't mean strictly the structure and graphical design of a page or a piece of content. I use accessible design to refer to the entire scope of how a website is made, from designing the user interfaces to actually entering content. Because most websites rely on written and visual communication, accessibility issues are most often seen as visual issues. So it's those with temporary or permanent vision problems, situations that require things like screen readers, which will read the content depending on how the site is structured, but it also affects those who have motor or mobility disabilities, such as those with cerebral palsy or someone who has had recently had a stroke. These are people who may not be able to use a mouse to perform fine movements with a trackpad. They may use the tab button to more quickly move around the screen. It also affects those with auditory disabilities, such as deafness. In fact, when I gave this talk at DrupalCon, my ear was plugged with an ear infection. So I was standing up here really having a difficult time just interpreting what people were saying to me through question and answer. And that was, not necessarily a permanent disability, but it was still a disability in terms of the situation I was put in. And it even encompasses those who have cognitive disabilities or language barriers, who simply can't understand some sort of overwritten government page content. And additionally, on top of all this, it's worth noting that not every disability is life-changing. Not every disability is permanent or even a disability in the minds of those who classify disabilities. But our websites don't know that. Because while there is an obvious spectrum of disabilities, there's a definite difference between someone who's lost an arm, or somebody with a broken arm, or somebody who's holding a child with one arm. To a website, all three are nearly identical. And finally, there's one additional gray area in accessibility, and that's the simple need and promise of information and what we can do to provide it in less than optimal conditions. So according to the Pew Research Center, just over 1 in 10 Americans are smartphone-only internet users. And just over 1 in 4 lives without a broadband internet connection. And it's 1 in 2 for those who are 65 and older. Additionally, over 4 million people, which is roughly the size of the audience that watched the series finale of NBC's Parks and Rec, classify themselves as immigrants with a less than good grasp of the English language. So these aren't issues of whether or not an image has a certain contrast or if a page can be tabbed through with a keyboard. These are issues of needing sites that can load on slow speed connections, sites that can easily be read with an in-browser translator, sites that conform not just to those who have a visible disability, but those who cannot afford the best computers or the fastest connections, or who are underrepresented in other ways. So how do we make real change happen? It happens on a psychological level when we understand really the two truths of accessibility. First, there's the understanding that the potential audience of a website or app is anyone who is human. This is a quote by Hayden Pickering I have up from his absolutely wonderful book, Inclusive Design Patterns. The book is about 50% development and about 50% wonderful thoughts on the editorial side of things. And it boils down to, you don't know who might hit your site, so at least make it welcoming when that stranger shows up. And the second is this: websites are made of code, and that code is translated by robots. And when I talk about robots, it's a bit of a joke, but what I'm talking about is that the systems that have been created over the past decades to help read and translate code, they're not like real people. They're programs. They don't understand nuance. They don't understand sarcasm or anything that might be implied through language or color. So we have to provide the context. And providing this context comes in two forms. First, it comes in the things that we can assign to a page template. This is stuff that is hopefully already baked into the development, and it's what makes up what we call a content model. So using Jeff Eaton's description of a content model, which is one of the best I've ever read, it breaks it down into three things. What kinds of things we make, how those things are related to each other, and what bits of information those things contain. And in terms of accessibility, it's those bits of information that allow us to make content read by a screen reader. It's those bits of information that allow us to tab through on a keyboard. It allows us to assign alternative text, images. It allows us to programmatically within the page template itself handle some of these issues that somebody with a disability might encounter. But then there's the stuff that goes inside of that content model, which is tied to the writing conventions of the web. What we write needs to be just as accessible as the navigation and the design. And that is done through this gray area of writing, through clear heading structure, through links that are understandable, videos that are captioned. So we'll get started right there. In this section, I want to talk about how to write and when to ignore the things that relate to the structure around the body field. So we'll talk about images, we'll talk about alternative text, we'll talk about video and podcast transcriptions, and we'll talk about the title field of our pages. I usually talk about PDFs here as well, if this is a longer workshop, but in an effort to save time, I've really summed it up into two rules. Number one, don't use them. And number two, if you do, make sure they're as accessible as an HTML page. Right, alternative text. Alternative text is really the heavyweight in the accessibility world, especially when it comes to what editors can do, largely because it deals with a major portion of the accessibility audience, those who cannot see. And it deals with a major part of the website, which would be the images. More so, alternative text can easily be tested by browser services like Wave. So it becomes really the base level of, is my site accessible? What do I need to fix? Which is unfortunate because alternative text then gets thrown into being a yes or no issue, even if really it ends up being one of the grayest of gray areas we run into. But it's one of the most frustrating things to understand. The rule to the letter is this: every non-text element requires a text alternative so that it can be read using assistive services, which means when we have a page like this, there are 4 areas on this page that require alternative text: the site logo, the header image, the social icons, and the products. Because without the images, that content is not conveyed. If these were not assigned some kind of alternative text, someone who was blind or somebody who could not visualize the images would have no way of knowing what they are not seeing. So in essence, what this alternative text does is it provides a text alternative to every image that is necessary for understanding the content. We provide text in each of these areas, so as they are encountered, they still convey the same ideas. In Drupal, alternative text is most often added in one of 2 places. First, you add alternative text to the image itself when it's uploaded. So this means whenever this image is added to a template in Drupal, unless it's overridden for some reason, this is the text that will be read by a screen reader. If you are adding something to the what you see is what you get editor or the WYSIWYG field, you also have an opportunity to add alternative text. In this case, this is pretty much any time you're going to be dropping an image in using that editor. Both of these things you'll have to confirm are set up correctly in your install. I can't speak to every individual install and whether or not the Drupal site is set up in the correct way for this, but this should be pretty standard. And what this actually does is it creates a little snippet of code that screen readers can read, which is alt equals, and then the term in quotes. So what you would write in this case, the alternative text is Corey Vilhauer. What that translates the image to is alt equals, and then in quotes, Corey Vilhauer. This is how you add it, but how do you actually write it? Ultimately, it depends on the context. Writing alternative text boils down to this. Alternative text conveys necessary information at a level that someone who can see the image might get. We'll get into the idea of what information means in a bit, but first, here's some examples. In this case, it's pretty easy. The slide actually has text in it. So the information we need to convey is the text within that slide. One note, remember that literally a robot with no understanding of context will be reading this. So when you write out the alt text, don't forget that you actually have to write out the dot in .com, or if something is an acronym like RED, it's going to be read as read. So you have to space those letters out in order for them to be read correctly. Read it to yourself, run it through a browser screen reader to confirm. I'll have a big list of tools later that you can take back and use every day. But in this case, we're going to write out the text that's on the image. The alt equals first time on vinyl in 15 years, the promise rings, nothing feels good, et cetera, et cetera. Another example is a table or a chart. Charts can be tricky. This image shows actual data, so the data needs to be integrated into the alternative text for this image in some way. The best and easiest thing to do would be to write out the actual data, but that can get too long for the alt text field, which means you have to provide one of two solutions. First, you can provide an alternative, and I just threw just a generic chart in here. Maybe it's an accessible table that shows the data outside of the image. In that case, you'd post this, chart of percentage of times an artist appears on a post-plunk playlist, see following table for data. Or you can host that information on a separate page or further down the page with an anchor. Then you actually link it within the alternative text. So in this case, alt equals chart of the percentage of times an artist appears on a post-plunk playlist, view table data as the link. And then somebody who's using a screen reader can actually click on that link and go to the full text description of this image. Both of these two examples are somewhat rare. You're best to make sure that data like this is actual content within the page and not trapped within an image. So that's the easiest way to handle things. Those are edge examples. Let's get into a more common example. Just a plain old ordinary image. No text, no data, just the image. Writing this kind of alternative text can land in a bit of a gray area because it depends solely on us interpreting the details required to make this image useful. This goes back to what I mentioned before. We're not tasked with describing the information itself. We're just tasked with describing the information the image is attempting to portray. So in some cases, it will be easy. A plate of pancakes is always going to be a plate of pancakes. But for others, like this one here, we have to think deeply about what the purpose of the image actually is. So you could write alternative text in several different ways. You could make it a short and fast description of the image. So alt equals a bunch of boxes. Or you could painstakingly describe it in detail. Alt equals 5 columns of non-symmetrical boxes with between 10 and 12 boxes in each column with randomized colors, including green, blue, white, red, black, yellow on a gray background. Or you could provide a description that's tied to the purpose of the image. And this is often where you're going to land. Alt equals a grid of differently colored boxes illustrating order among chaos. In this case, there is contextual information in the image that you can't really fully describe by simply describing the shape or number of things in that image. Some quick final hints on writing alternative text. There's no need to write picture of or image of. This is already implied. Keep things really short. Screen readers can actually cut off text. So make sure you keep it roughly around 100 to 125 characters. Not only will they cut off the text, but it's kind of, it can come across as an actual real pain if you have an alt text that has 500 characters in it, because somebody who's trying to scan through a page is going to have to listen to this long description. In fact, if we go back to this example, this alternative text is really way too long. Unfortunately, there's not much you can do to help that because the text is there. The text is in the image. Really, the answer to this isn't to make the alt text shorter. The answer here is to make sure that the alt text is not part of the image in the first place. And then finally, make sure your Drupal install is set up that you don't have file name fallbacks, which means if you leave something purposely blank, it doesn't just automatically try to help, and I say help in quotes, by using the file name as the alt text. Because what that leads to is things like this. And you'll have to tell me if this works. Did that come through, the sound?
It was very, very light. If you can turn it up, that would be helpful.
Let's see if this works. That worked that time?
That was better, I think. Yeah.
Okay. Well, essentially what it is the screen reader voice comes through and says digital art 1444990_640, which is not what that image is. It's a purely decorative image. This is actually worse than having no alt tag at all. In fact, in this case, you specifically wanted the alt tag to be blank, and the CMS has, under the guise of helpfulness, changed your field. Now, I know this is kind of where things get weird, because I have just been talking about how you need alt tags on all your images, but now sometimes I'm saying that they will be blank. And this is the troublesome part of alternative text. This is the bad, very difficult to use part of alternative text, the exceptions. This is our first real foray into this gray area of inclusion, which can be a really tricky line to balance. It's not as easy as blanketing every image with alternative text. Remember, the idea of alternative text is to create an experience that mirrors the visual experience. But in order to do that, we need to understand how images and graphics are used on a website. First off, we have to understand that not every image is necessary to the site itself. Some images are what we call decorative, and some are considered structural. These are things that, as we roll through a site, scanning with our eyes, we zip right past them. They may offer like a level of graphic ambiance, but they don't present any actual content, and therefore we do not encounter them outside of a general feeling. For example, there is structural content. This is the design from my blog back now 8.5 years ago. This is, it includes graphical layout, these horizontal lines, footer barriers, things like that. These are not here to provide any sort of content. They're just there to add to the design. They should be invisible to somebody who cannot see them. They should be ultimately ignored, but every image requires an alt tag. Otherwise, a screen reader will look at it and will just scream like, what the hell is this? So what we have to do is provide a blank alt tag. Alt equals blank. From the editor side of things, you rarely need to worry about this. These are usually always baked into the template itself. Then there's images that are already nestled next to some other sort of identifying text. This is the case where the image is adjacent to text that already describes it. So examples of this include a directory that includes the name of the person next to their image, or a caption on an image within a publication, or an icon that sits alongside a heading. And the reason for this goes back to the reason behind alternative text in general. It provides an explanation for images that cannot be seen for whatever reason. In all of the above cases, the explanation is already there. It's in the title or it's in the name. In fact, in all of these cases, providing alternative text to the images adds a layer of noise to the page. So instead of simply reading the person's name or this caption, it's reading the person's name and the alternative text. So in this case over here, Bill Bartell is read twice. Here's another example. This may not come through, but we'll see. So really what its voice is doing is your screen reader is reading a red panda next to a bamboo tree twice, because you've captioned it with that, but you've also provided alt text on that image as well. And finally, alternative text can be skipped if the image provides no actual communication value outside of page decoration. And this is where real gray areas sprout up. Where the line is drawn in regards to decoration is still largely a matter of opinion and editorial judgment. There are some that believe a university carousel slide or a page hero of students under trees conveys necessary information. And they're not wrong. It provides a feeling for campus life, or it helps students visualize themselves on campus as a student. There are others, and I often find myself in this camp, that feel while these are nice accent pieces that provide a way of breaking up the page or providing a splash of color, they have no actual contextual value to the content of the page. And those people also are not wrong. In this case, the first example, you have to look at it and wonder, what does a bronze coyote have anything to do with the search page on this university site? So these also would have the alt equals blank in these situations. The good thing is we don't have to make these decisions ourselves. The alternative text decision tree was created by the Web Accessibility Initiative, and it goes through essentially a decision tree, a flowchart of how to use alternative text in various situations. We walk through each of these questions until you get a decent answer. It's wildly useful in helping you make the hard decision of when you might need to skip alternative text, which is going to be a lot more often than you probably originally thought. All right, enough about alternative text, kind of. Let's move on to alternative text, but this time for moving and audio things. And that would be transcripts and transcriptions. With captions and transcriptions and transcripts, we shift in focus from visual media toward audible media. And that's a bit of a misnomer. So the idea that videos are captioned for the deaf or hard of hearing has really become outdated. Now videos are captioned because you have the computer's sound down. They're captioned because you're on a bus or you're on the quiet car. They are captioned because the text itself is easier to search and index, or because not everyone consumes information in the same way. When it comes down to it, videos are no longer captioned just for disability. They are captioned because having multiple options is always the best option. Eileen Webb gave a great talk called Integrating Accessibility at a Now What conference a few years back. And she says that your video and audio content is not ready for the web until there are captions or a transcription. And so there's a difference between the two content types, and it largely depends on the use of the video or audio and what you want to get out of it. Captions are useful when the video is meant to be viewed in real time with the text, like a live event or something in which the video is closely tied to the audio, something like a comedic sketch where timing matters. With captions, you're tying your text directly to the video itself, which means in addition to the words, you have to consider timestamping, you have to consider matching that text to the correct spot in the video. In most other cases, videos should be transcribed. The difference is somewhat subtle. Transcriptions separate the text from the audio, and they provide what is essentially an article view of the content. The benefits of which are that the video is no longer the focus. The text and content is. This obviously doesn't work for live events, and if the text is closely tied to the graphics you're showing, it's going to feel a little disjointed. But for everything else, it's positively the best option. And it's not all about videos either. Any medium that requires sound should have a transcription attached to it, unless, again, it's dealing with live sound. So podcasts, Paul Ford and Rich Zad's Track Changes is great, where they post a full transcript of every podcast they put up. The full conversation is listed in a blog post. Or conference talks. It's a no-brainer for me to transcribe every talk I give on my blog, because even if it's not being videotaped, I make sure to post a transcript of it. It's just good content. It allows search engines to find your stuff. For both transcripts and captions, you can use a video hosting service. Like I use YouTube to handle the text itself. What's great about YouTube is that you can set it to auto pause whenever you're typing, which allows you to sort of hold off on that rewind, play, pause, try to capture everything charade you might have to do otherwise. So when you're done, you've got a transcript and you can just copy and paste it where you need it to go. And you can just delete the video from YouTube altogether if you're not interested in keeping it there. One thing to note is that this takes time. And so if time is an issue, but a little money is not, you can easily outsource this stuff to someone who can professionally transcribe it for you. It might take a little bit of cleaning up in those cases. There's no way someone not connected to your work will be perfect at typing out names or initiatives or understand muddy voices or accents, but it's going to save a lot of time, and it's going to become a much more usable piece of content. Finally, let's wrap up this section by talking about one last thing, and that is the title field. The title field gets used in about 70 million different ways, depending on how the site is set up. It can be the navigation title. It can be the title pushed for search engines to pick up. can be the title of an article. It can be the title of the piece of content itself within the CMS. All of these uses have one major thing in common, and that is that they all contribute to wayfinding on the site, especially for somebody who's using a screen reader to navigate content. The title field is important to accessibility because it is what is announced when a new web page is loaded. So this is really your time to shine. This is your first introduction to the page content, and it should be concise, and it should be accurate, and it should be clear. So what this means is being clear about the page content. The title field is not a time to be wacky. It's a time to make things understandable. The basics of this are this. Give an informative title that is short but understandable. Then if it works within your templates, you can provide the title of the site. So here's an example from the Blend Interactive site. It works because it says exactly what it is. This is the page that lists our team, and so we've called this page Our Team. I know exactly what I'm getting when I land on this page, Our Team. We have built within the content management system a suffix for every page on the site, which is just Blend Interactive. This is okay because we put it at the end. Remember, people using screen readers are going to encounter this anytime they reach a page. So we don't want them hearing Blend Interactive, Blend Interactive, Blend Interactive every time they go to a page. So it's necessary to take this and make it a suffix. So if somebody is scanning through it, it reads as Our Team, Blend Interactive. This allows us to brand each page for search engine results without overworking someone's ears. Again, unfortunately, there aren't rules to this. There's no yes or no answer for what should be in these titles, just editorial judgment as to whether the title should be this, degrees, or this, undergraduate programs and majors, liberal arts college, University of Choice, Sioux Falls, South Dakota, or something clear and concise right in the middle. Undergraduate programs and majors, University of Choice, in this case, the University of Sioux Falls. If this sounds a little bit like we're talking about writing, you're right. We are talking about writing. So let's dive right into that. This next section is really about writing for accessibility. We're talking about writing for, ultimately, the web, which means we're essentially talking about a mix of two things. We're talking about copywriting in the traditional sense, writing for a purpose, designed to help people make decisions and take actions. And we're talking about plain language, which is the art, and I mean that in all seriousness, it is an art of providing access to content for people with a wide variety of reading levels. The Center for Plain language means the target audience can read, understand, and confidently act on your information, on the information in your content. Which means the definition of plain is a definition that shifts with the audience. What is plain language for one audience may not be plain language for another audience. Content that is specific to, say, a biology teacher is going to reach a different level of plainness than content meant for their students. And this takes a lot of work. And I'm afraid it takes a lot of time. Not just time in that we will spend more time writing content, but in that we will spend years gradually honing our craft until we've reached a spot where we feel a little more comfortable than we did before. Until we get there, though, let's look at some rules to make things a little easier. First, writing so text is scannable is really the next thing we need to look at. We're often bombarded with text like this, giant paragraphs of text that are both difficult to understand at first glance, and they're really intimidating for anyone who doesn't have a high reading level. What's more, the absence of headings, which we'll talk about in a bit, makes this completely non-scannable for anyone using a screen reader. This content is ready to burst from its seams with information, yet it's so bound up that it barely says anything at first glance. This text is daunting. It's inaccessible. It's an example of what we would call bad content design. Instead, content should be built in a way that's airy and free. You can see that there are different sections, subheadlines, bullet points. There are 5 things that we've added here that make this more readable. We've made sure that there's a relevant headline instead of a cute headline. We talked about this with titles, and we'll talk about it a bit with heading levels. We're saying, what's this page or section all about? We're writing in shorter chunks of content, making sure that there's just one thought per paragraph. We are using subheads that further break down the body of content and signify to the browser where content concepts are located. We're using bullet points to say, this is a list of things that you need to know. And then finally, we're using clear and actionable links, which we will also talk about later. The positive of writing like this is that by assigning headings, properly labeling links, and using fewer but more important words, we are doing two things. We are providing an easier page to translate, and we are providing better search engine optimization. We are being deliberate with our language. And we have to remember that search engines rely on other people linking content and showing preference. If you can be readable and scalable and deliberately accessible, people will read it. Good copy is better than optimized copy. Sometimes you're going to get asked about reading level. And reading level is really important sometimes. So when we are diving into the readability of words, we tend to want to slink over into these automated tools. Writing is a very difficult task, and when we are faced with gray areas, we want to confirm that we're doing it right. This is where tests like the Flesch-Kincaid test come in. For example, this is a page from gov.uk about bringing animals into the country. If we take this page and we throw it through the readability tester, we can see it has been written at roughly an 8th to 10th grade level. Even more, you can visually see that it's been designed in the same way as our positive example before. There's a lot of shorter sentences, a lot of actionable links, a lot of clear headings. This page is from the CDC here in the US, and this is maybe an older version of it, but it has similar content. It looks a little bit more complicated. It has headings, but it also has a few small walls of text. And according to the readability testing, it's roughly 3 grades higher, from 11th to 13th, essentially a college level of text. And that's all fine, but the issue is that reading level requires context. These are nice to know scores, but in fact, they are just that. They're scores, they're numbers. They can help you make a point, but they will not accurately represent your content in the way that actual reading or testing will represent your content. There's still a need to make sure that you are taking the things you write for your site and testing them with real people, running them by a handful of customers, probing for a meeting, making sure that it's understood by the people who are reading the page. Because in fact, I'd rarely use reading level scores when I'm looking at content. And instead, I go even more basic, which is a thing called Simple Writer. Simple Writer was created by Randall Munroe of XKCD fame. And it's based on the concept of Upgoer 5, which is a cartoon that attempted to explain the mechanical workings of Saturn V, the rocket that sent the astronauts for the first lunar landing, using only the top 1,000 words in the English language. For example, I took a before and after from plainlanguage.gov, which I will link to in the talk notes because plainlanguage.gov is the most amazing site when it comes to plain language, obviously. It's an absolute treat of a resource to find better understanding on how to reword things and how to make things easier for people with cognitive disabilities or a low reading level. And in this example, this is actually from an application for federal assistance that they used for training. The original content needs to be adjusted a bit. It needs to be made more simple. We need to remove the passive sentences. We need to be clear in our needs. We need to make all actions come from the user instead of making them relate to the reaction of the agency. And in fact, you can see very few of the words in this text are within that top 1,000 words. You can see in this rewrite that we are using a much simpler concept. There are fewer harder to read words, but we haven't gotten rid of all of the red words. It's not perfect. Those words in red are a lot less scary than the ones in the first example, which brings up a point. Sometimes you can't simplify to a perfect level. We can't always rely on tests or tools to make sure our stuff is written perfectly to a reading level test, because these tests don't understand our context. They don't understand our audiences. Instead we have to look to our audiences. We need to make sure things are understandable for those who will need this content, even if it doesn't match a specific readability level. Sometimes it won't even be a text thing at all. This is the Code of Federal Regulations for warnings on a vehicle that could roll over at high speeds. This is the rollover warning label text. This was written in 1987. And according to our testing, it's roughly a 10th to 12th grade level of reading score. But in this case, the solution wasn't even to make the text more simple. It was simply to visualize things. The text is simpler, yes, roughly a 9th grade level instead of 12th, but most importantly, you don't even need to understand English to get an idea of what's going on in this. This car could roll over, so wear a seatbelt. One thing we really need to work on, especially those of us who consider ourselves native speakers of the English language, is that our language is filled with one-time use words and all this weird garbage that serves an incredibly specific use, if they even serve a use at all. These words, jargon words and idioms and weird metaphors, can be important to provide description and creative cache to longer articles and prose. But when we're writing informative content for actual site users who just want to find information or buy some shoes or bring their dog across the border, we need to understand that the best words to use are the clearest words. They are the words that can be understood both by us and by robot translators. Idioms do not translate, which means someone who does not understand an idiom especially won't understand it if it's translated, rendering your content completely inaccessible to several sections of the world, from those who don't speak English as a native language, to those who are unfamiliar with your region's weird terms, to those who are on the autism spectrum and can't fully comprehend the gray areas of speech and read this as completely literal. And here's an example. That's how the cookie crumbles is translated into French as this, which I won't pronounce because I don't get the accent right ever. When we translate that back, we already realize we've lost this in translation. This is how icing on the cake is how it retranslates. We've already, one level of translation, we've already lost all of the meaning of that idiom. All right, finally, let's talk about how we organize these things for meaning within the page. We've talked a lot about writing for humans to understand, and we've talked about the fields that we need to keep track of in order to make sure web browsers can understand what they're supposed to do. But within that blob of the what you see is what you get editor is a bit of both. It's a mix of titles and it's a mix of web browser learning. It's headings and heading structure. So for those who don't know, headings and text are most often seen as section headlines and subheadlines. In fact, we see these on most long form content written today. This would be the H1 of the article. Think back to middle school, where we all learned the basic construction of an essay: introduction, 3 supporting paragraphs, conclusion. By constraining to those 5 sections, we learned how to move beyond those sections. We better understand how arguments are made. We better understand how to frame sections as subsections. We know how to write compelling, good copy. Web browsers and RSS feeds and search crawlers and accessibility tools, they also understand how a piece of content is constructed, but they didn't grow. They don't suddenly gain context. They don't understand complicated syntax, which means it's up to us to help them understand what's important. What is the title, the H1? What are the main components? When do we start going down the sub-thought rabbit hole? So in this case, when something reads an H1, for people who are using screen readers, this is the shortcut that says this is the title of the page. Everything after that should be an H2. This is a shortcut that says here's a giant section of content. H3 are subsections within that section of content. And it's important to be specific with how these headings are set up. Once we see how one heading and one chunk of content feeds into each other, you can begin to see how scannability is harmed when we don't use our headings in order. When we use headings as visual cues instead of structural cues, without regard to the actual structural cues that lie below, we start creating problems. We end up with out of order headings because we think the H3 might look better than an H2. When we do this, we really mess up the screen reader's idea of place. We mess up how a page is organized. So instead of going in a logical order, it's like we've just rearranged everything. So here's an example. For all pages outside of the home page, your page title is going to be H1. This means your body copy should start with second level headings for its major sections. If you go any deeper, throw that into third and fourth level headings. In this case, each of these blocks are developed to be an H2 by default because they're automatically a new section on this page. And in the bottom, you can see the block sections and block subsections are an H2 and an H3. Writing these headings is going to follow the same rules we had when we talked about titles as well. These are things that sometimes we have to set ourselves. We don't get to build this into the structure of the site because our content is always changing. So this is a blog post I wrote for the now defunct, but still very much live Contents magazine on how to create a content strategy methodology. When you read my subheads, these are the H2s of this article. You can see a natural progression of what this article was about. You can easily scan this. I made promises that I then kept in the text that I wrote. Not just you, but somebody using a screen reader can skip through these headings and see it, or somebody who doesn't have time to dive into the entire article knows where to go in this text. When I write articles, I usually write the entire thing out before I start assigning headlines. So doing this allows me to see where the topic is shifting, and I can use my headlines to signify the shift in ideas. I don't write headings until I'm done with the full post, but there is also the side where you write an outline and then you fill in from there. This is just as valid of a way to write headings, is to figure out what your outline is and then add your paragraphs after that. Finally, let's talk about descriptive text links. Where headings are designed for scannability and navigation, links are designed to actually take you elsewhere. They become the other fast navigation method for somebody using both assistive technology, somebody simply using their keyboard to move around the page. So what this means is that sometimes people will only see or hear the text of the link, none of the contextual information around it, none of the paragraphs before or after, just the text of the link. So when someone tabs through, they might hear this.
Neil Armstrong, link. Buzz Aldrin, link. Lunar module, link.
So if you couldn't hear that, every time you tabbed over something, the screen reader read the link itself. Neil Armstrong, link. Buzz Aldrin, link. Lunar module, link. When I hear the screen reader say Buzz Aldrin, I know that it's going to go to Buzz Aldrin. When I hear it say lunar module, I know I'm going to learn about a lunar module. That's not always the case, though, because blogging and forums sometimes take to writing links more as emphasis than as actual links to content. When they write way too long links that take way too long to get through, this is editorially killing the purpose of your link to a screen reader, because your screen reader cannot understand what you are trying to link them to. So this is a very specific article from The Ringer. This looks like 3 links, but in actuality, they have linked 13 different sites in here, 1 for every word. Going through a screen reader, what you end up hearing is this.
The link. Most link. Successful link.
All right, and that keeps going, but it's the link, most link, successful link. Instead, I should get a sense of where it is going based on the underlined text itself. All 3 of the previous links should have been written something more like this. I'm talking about procedural crime dramas. And it says it's arguably the most successful genre in the history of American television. Instead, write it as is arguably the most successful genre in the history of American television, as shown by classics like NYPD Blue, Law & Order, CSI, and NCIS. In these cases, I know if I click on NYPD Blue, I'm going to get the page for NYPD Blue, instead of clicking on a link that says the. The same can be done for an over-descriptive link, which is going to, I'm not going to play this one because it's really long, but essentially this entire link is one link, and the screen reader reads it as, a wee old woman came in and said, I have a question. What? This page 7 in all the books I take out have the 7 underlined in pen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It goes on and on and on. It doesn't actually give the location of where it's going. In this case, the link should have been on a separate sentence after it. The full thread tells the story of an old secret library code for remembering books. All of these examples, we're taking users to text pages, and that's cool. Text pages are text pages. But what happens when we are linking to a PDF? What happens when we're linking to a video? What happens when we need to prepare our site users for something even more unexpected? Simply put, we have to be honest. We have to tell site users when they're going to a PDF. We have to tell them when they're going to a video. We have to tell them when they're going off site. The best way to do this is to have your site set up in a way that makes things automatic, if possible. So for example, you've probably seen sites with PDF icons or external link icons. These are often programmed into the site itself to say, you're going to an external site. The trick here is that there's a little bit of alt text assigned to the icon itself, or the site has been programmatically created to have a little note inserted into the link as it's read by a screen reader. But also what this does is it signifies to somebody using a mobile device that if you click on this, you're going to go to a PDF, which means a PDF is going to download on your page, on your browser, which means if you don't want to download a PDF, if you don't want to waste your data on this, definitely don't click on this link. When the link is read, it includes the text in the parentheses as well. So if you don't have anything set up with PDF icons or fancy little link signifiers, you can just write it into the link itself. In this case, external resources, in brackets, new window, will let somebody know that when you click on this link, it's going to open up a new tab. Or student body profile, PDF, is going to let somebody know that it's going to link to a PDF. I want to use the last little bit of time here to talk about change. Because as the root of every web problem is this idea of change. Change in how we handle things internally, change in how we work through problems, change from what we were taught or what we have assumed. Ultimately, in order for accessibility work to be handled in the editing process, it first has to become something that is a priority organizationally. You know, in almost every sense, updating and creating content for accessibility is an issue of time. It takes extra time to review content, and it takes extra time to think about somebody beyond your own mind. It takes time, and so time needs to be allocated, which can be a really tricky thing to bring up. In essence, you're asking for better support for editorial accessibility. Means you're asking for more budget, and it means you're asking for more attention. You're asking someone to take this on their shoulders and champion not just the obvious examples, but everyone who might come in contact with your site. Not enough just to pass the tests, but enough to provide a true positive user experience. And it doesn't really help that accessibility is a lightning rod. No one wants to admit that they've made a mistake or willingly or unwillingly excluded somebody through non-inclusive design. So I guarantee there will be a tendency to get defensive about those mistakes. I mean, I look back at some of the first projects that I ever worked on. It's not the spelling errors or the bad strategy that I'm embarrassed by. It's the fact that I was so self-centered in my worldview that I unwillingly included non-inclusive language or non-inclusive design in the sites I helped build. But that's the past. You know, I don't worry about those mistakes anymore. We've gone back and we've fixed those. I've tried to make them better. And instead, my goal is to worry about the mistakes that could come up in the future and protect against those. There's nothing we can do to fix the past, so we have to start working toward the present and beyond. When non-accessible writing comes across our desk, we have to help to make it better. We have to explain why it matters. We don't get mad, we don't get haughty, we just help everyone get better. Even if through sheer repetition and will, it's something that gets fixed. We can start with the things that feel commonplace, and from there we slowly build these things into our workflow. First, implement a checklist. Does your organization have a checklist or a guide for creating content? Even if that guide is only 5 bullet points long, make sure that check accessibility is on that list. Then run it by someone, even if you don't have questions. Not everyone is going to work in this every single day, including you. So make sure you get a second opinion on things to make sure more minds are solving the problem. Then make sure the process has a champion, accessibility guru or ninja or whatever LinkedIn term is used these days. Someone who is responsible for the main details, essentially. You know, even if you train everyone, that group will slowly forget if they're not using it every day. So make sure someone is using it every day. And part of that is making sure that you have empowered your accessibility champion through education. You know, do what it takes to give that person everything they can do to make sure they are the expert in accessibility in your organization. Okay, there's so much more. Accessibility is not a thing you can even tackle in an hour or in a day, or even really over a lifetime, it feels like. Over time, you're gonna find things that are changing and they're updating, and you'll get better and better at what you need to do, but nothing can be perfect. So I've referenced a lot of things in this talk. I've talked about resources, I've talked about articles and books and testing tools. I've collected all of these resources in one place, and I will link to that at the end, along with the slides to this presentation and anything else I've talked about. In fact, it includes a recording of the DrupalCon talk I gave back in April, and I will update it to include this recording if that works. I want you to come away with 3 things from this webinar, 3 high-level ideas that really work to change our perception of accessibility in our writing and in our content model. First, I want you to understand accessibility's reach, that it's not just people who are blind and deaf, but it's anyone who is in an environment that might differ from yours. Somebody who is just learning English, somebody who has a broken arm, somebody who's living in poverty or has a slow or no broadband connection. I want you to see that really accessibility is all about options. It's about understanding that providing both a video and a transcript adds a benefit, that images aren't the only way to convey understanding, that we need multiple ways into our content, just like a building needs multiple ways in for different ability types. And finally, I want you to understand that the most accessible content is clear and concise content. It can be translated better. It can be understood by many grade levels of reading comprehension. It makes things easier and clearer for those who have to wade through the rest of this website's container. And I'll go ahead and throw a fourth in as well. Be okay with gray areas. Accessibility is not a checkbox. It's not a binary issue. And that's really hard. Because when we learn to write, we learn rules. We learn rules in writing because knowing the basics is important, and it's what helps us shape language. But the basics can't solve every problem. Creativity and judgment are needed to make decisions and to take chances. And while we don't often see web writing as a place where chances are taken, we have to understand that there is a balance to what we do. That there are rules, and there's the interpretation of those rules. And that interpretation, frankly, scares the shit out of a lot of people, but it doesn't have to be hard. All we need to do is understand that the gray areas are only gray to those of us who are living without disabilities. Someone who can't see, there's no gray area. They know exactly what works and they know exactly what doesn't. Someone with a broken arm knows exactly why it's difficult to key through a site. And someone who grew up in another country understands why the complicated instructions on their insurance company's website is difficult to translate. We're afraid to be wrong, but we don't have to be. For years, the bare minimum was enough, but not anymore. Instead, we need to put ourselves into the minds of those who will be encountering our bare minimum, as we shoot for something better. Not perfect, but better. So let's get out there and start making things better today. Thank you. That's what I have. The link on here, eatingelephant.com, is my blog. And Drupal for Gov is the extension to get the notes and slide deck for this webinar.
Great. Thank you so much, Corey. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no problem.
At this point, if folks have any questions for Corey, feel free to go ahead and unmute yourself and ask them. Otherwise, you can plug them into the chat and we can monitor there as well. So we'll just open it up for a few minutes of questions if anybody has any. Okay, it looks like no questions, so that's it. So again, thank you, Corey, so much. For those of you that are on the call, we will be there'll be a follow-on email where we will include the link to where the recording of this session will be, as well as a very short, I promise, short survey where we ask that you just provide some feedback on the webinar topic, as well as help us out with potential future topics. So again, please stay tuned. We have additional webinars scheduled for October and November, and we'll be linking to those in the follow-on email as well. But you can, know that our October issue will be on the concept of value-based team management. So look for more information and advertising about that. And again, we just appreciate everybody's time and hope you all found this useful. And we'll talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.